Um, there are certainly scenes that I remember, but they tend not to be the ones that are fun to write. They tend to be actually the ones that are painful to write. I mean, the hardest thing I ever wrote was the Red Wedding scene in The Storm of Swords, and I knew that was coming. I was enough of an architect there that I was building toward that scene. I've been building for that scene since the first book. But when I actually reached that scene, it was too painful to write. I couldn't write it. I skipped over it. It occurs about two-thirds of the way through The Storm of Swords. I skipped over it and I wrote the scenes that follow. I finished the entire book, and I hadn't written that scene yet. That was the last thing I wrote for Storm of Swords. I had to go back and make myself write it. And it's still emotionally, you become very attached to these characters, believe it or not. I know I have a reputation for gleefully killing someone. That's not entirely deserved. Sometimes it's very painful for me to kill them. They're my children for good or ill. So that was a tough scene to write. I do periodically enjoy, if I write something that I'm particularly proud of, that really is, that I think is a good piece of writing, that is vivid and evocative, then that gives me pleasure. But it might not necessarily be the scenes that you guys would particularly enjoy. Some of them are just quiet things about, I have to describe this landscape, and I sweat and rewrite it, and I finally get, this is a great description of three guys riding through a grassy meadow. I've gotten the sights and the sounds and the smells of the scene right to put you there. But it's not necessarily anything that ordinary readers or reviewers will ever, oh my God, it was such a beautiful description of a grassy meadow on page 314. So,
At what point did you start to write outside the confines of the Song of Ice and Fire cycle? And I'm thinking here of the Dunk and Egg Hedge Knight stuff, because that seemed, that was published quite early was that conceived as part of this story that just didn't fit? How did that come about?
That was Robert Silverberg's fault.
Right.
Robert Silverberg decided he was going to do an anthology called Legends, which consisted of original stories. He wanted 10 fantasy writers, each writing a story in their fantasy world, an original story, never before published. And he was offering what was quite a substantial advance, or I think a record advance for a story in any anthology. So, and his lineup was amazing. It was, Terry Pratchett and Stephen King were going to be in this, and Anne McCaffrey, and all of the best-selling fantasy writers. And I was just getting into my series then. I really didn't belong in that number, but I knew that I wanted to be in this book. So when he invited me to be in this book, I gleefully accepted. And then I had to think, well, what am I going to write for this book? I'm still in the middle of writing. I think I was still in the middle of writing Clash of Kings. The only book out then was Game of Thrones. Well, am I going to write a story about Tyrion or Arya or Jon Snow? No, I can't do that. I have to save that for the book. I have to do this. I have to do a prequel. So I started thinking about my history and what would be a good area to write it, and I came up with the Dunk and Egg stuff. I was particularly attracted. That whole story is built around a tournament, and I love medieval tournaments and reading about them, writing about them. There's of course some of them in the main books, but this was an opportunity in a time of peace, not war, to look at a medieval tournament with all its pageantry and the jousting and the combat, and reveal a little of Westerosi history. And like many other things, it grew. I gardened it. I started it, and suddenly it was all there. Actually, I was so long doing it that Bob tried to throw me out of the book. I was late delivering Clash of Kings, which everybody knew about, and he was approaching. He'd gotten a lot of money for this anthology, and he wanted to deliver it on the deadline. So all stories were due at the end of the year on December 31st. And he said, George, I hear you're so late from the book. I can't afford my book to be late, so now I'm dropping you from the book, and we're going to replace you. And I said, no, you're not. I have a contract here, and I'm not late yet. You may think I'm going to be late, but I'm not late yet. So you have to keep me in the book. So that's why Legends actually has 11 stories in it, not the original 10. He actually replaced me and found another guy, but I refused to be replaced. And I wrote the story, and goddamn it, I got it to him on December 31st, which is at the same time, as I understand it, like 5 of the stories came in, so I'm not the only writer who pushes things. And actually, I think that story, that was one of the best decisions I ever made there, was because there was a real jump in my sales figures between Game of Thrones and Clash of Kings. And I think that story in Legends had a lot to do with it. I've had a lot of people come up to me over the ensuing years and say, I'd never heard of you. I bought Legends because there was a new Stephen King story in it, but I loved your story and I started reading your stuff. Or, you know, I'd never heard of you, but I bought Legends for the Terry Pratchett story, and then I read your story, and it was great, and all that stuff. I think I gained a lot of readers by being in Legends.
Do you plan to do any more? Have people here read the Dunk and Egg stories? Yeah. Do you plan to do any more of them? Is this one of the projects at HBO?
I do. I've written 3 to date, and I think I need to write another, 9, something like that. But I have pretty well their entire lives in my head. And of course, all those things will become more detailed as I write them. But first I have to finish. I have this book, The Winds of Winter. I have to finish that. And then I can write another Dunk and Egg story. And then I write A Dream of Spring. And then I write another Dunk and Egg story. At some point in there, I have to write the second part of Fire and Blood. So I have my work cut out for me. Why am I talking to you here?
Well, you know, George, I wasn't going to ask about The Winds of Winter. Tell me about, you obviously love, or you seem to love collaboration, world building. Tell me a little about Wildcard.
Or the network won't let you do something. The studio said they don't have the money for it. The other writers have different ideas. So the same thing is both very good and very, very bad, very frustrating. There's no, as a creative person, there's no control greater than what you get when you are sitting all alone in front of a computer, in front of a typewriter. You're making up your world. You can do anything you want. You're God. In television, you're sort of a god, but sort of a minor god. There are big gods. There are bigger gods above you that can smack you down at any time. So 2 different ways of telling stories, and both of them have their pluses and minuses.
So you used to write an episode per season at the beginning you write an episode per season of Thrones? Or was that
yes.
the contractual stipulation?
That was I had the option to write an episode per season. Because I knew, going back again to my 10 years in television, I worked on Twilight Zone, did a little bit of work on Max Headroom, but my episodes were never filmed. Then I worked for 3 years, the entire run of Beauty and the Beast. At that point, I'd risen through the ranks in the television hierarchy from staff writer, which was my first position. You know that staff writer is a very lowly position because it's the only one that has the word writer in the title. And then from there, I moved up to story editor and executive story editor and co-producer, producer, supervising producer. And I was set to become an executive producer, a showrunner, which is the big title. But then Beauty and the Beast ended, and then I got a development deal where they're just paying me, studios are paying me money to come up with ideas for TV shows, to come up with ideas for TV movies, feature films, what have you. And I wrote a number of those over the ensuing 5 years. And that can be very lucrative, but ultimately I found it very unsatisfying because nothing was made. They pay you and you have meetings, you get invested in the world, you love these characters, and then they don't make them. Nobody ever reads what you wrote except 4 guys in a room. And I guess I discovered something about myself that I'm a little like an actor or something. I want the applause. or I want them to throw the rotten fruit at me, but whatever, I want to come out on the stage at the end of it, I'm done, and know that an audience, whether it's the audience in a theater of a few hundred, or whether it's an audience of 20 million on the television sets of America, has seen what I've come up with. I wanted that. But at that stage, when I finally went back to books with Game of Thrones, I really wanted to be a showrunner, to do it, and be the captain of the ship instead of just the first mate or one of the swabbies. But then 20 years passed, and by the time Game of Thrones was ready to go to HBO, number one, I was right in the middle of the series. I had 4 books out, and I was struggling to finish Dance with Dragons at that time, and I knew there were 2 more after that. I couldn't, being a showrunner on a television show is a 24-hour-a-day job. I mean, it's a hugely high-stress, busy job. There's crises every day. There's always something to do. It takes all your attention. I couldn't do that without abandoning the books entirely, and that I wasn't willing to do. Books were still number 1 priority. But I did want to keep my hand in, so I got a contract that said I could write 1 episode per season, and I did in the beginning seasons. But it took me about a month to do each of those episodes. Even though they were adaptations, almost in every case, adaptations of scenes and material that I'd already written in the book, so I was just really transferring it from one medium to another. At a certain point, when we got into season 5, the butterfly effect had kicked in, and the show had gotten a little further away from my books, and I no longer had adaptations to do. I would have had to be working on scenes that never occurred in the books and so forth. And at that point I said, well, it's taking me a month just to do straight adaptations. Here it's going to take me 6 weeks minimum, maybe 2 months to write these scripts. It's too long. And David and Dan have done a great job. I think I'll step back and just concentrate on the books. And that's what I did.
And given that divergence, how do you now regard what is now the completed sort of corpus of Game of Thrones, the HBO series, within this broad world of Westeros, which you've explored in different directions? I mean, where does it fit in?
Well, it's 2 different ways of telling a story. I mean, I ask people sometimes, how many children does Scarlett O'Hara have? And for those of you who know Gone with the Wind, anybody? Best-selling, most popular movie of all time, and a mega bestseller, of course. In Margaret Mitchell's book, Scarlett O'Hara has 3 children. In the movie, Scarlett O'Hara has 1 child, which is correct, which is right, which is true. True, Scarlett O'Hara had no children because she didn't exist. She was a made-up fictional character. So both of them are equally true. You could do a Gone with the Wind graphic novel next month. You could have 12 children. That would also be equally true. We're making up stories here. So yeah, I'm telling a version in my books, and the show, which had different constraints and different deadlines and different needs, has told a very similar story, close in some respects, exactly the same in some respects, different in other respects.
Let's move from the ridiculous to the sublime and stop talking about television, start talking about history. First of all, I want to ask you about the history of the real world and its influence on your writing